we favor Gemini 1.5 Flash over everything else. We found that the OpenAI models tend to be the best analysts, the Anthropic models tend to be the best writers, and Gemini models broadly tend to be the best detectives. We trust the Anthropic prompt generator by a lot. We're making the bet that it's going to get easier and easier with prompt caching, batching. Inside all of this, so everything below Escalate is actually a retool app that is embedded within my actual code. So this is happening hundreds and hundreds of times a day for every one of the customers that we support. When you want to ask an LLM to do something, you better have a pretty damn good idea what good looks like for yourself. Talking about how to put AI in my business is about as broad and silly as talking about how do I use Excel in my business.
That's Arjun, CEO of ResiDesk. They power over 1 million AI chats per month. Their clients interact with AI in almost every single part of their product, but they don't know it. In this interview, he shows me how to create business-grade prompts using Claude's Workbench, how he saves hundreds of hours on development using Retool and Command Bar, and why he favors Gemini 1.5 Flash over any other model. Let's get into show and tell. So Arjun, I sent out this Twitter thread asking who are the scrappiest LLM operators I knew, and you were mentioned more than anybody else in the entire thing. So I was super excited to get on the phone with you. You told me about a wild stat about ResiDesk, about how many chats you're processing with AI per month. And so I'd love to hear about that as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Arjun. I'm the co-founder of ResiDesk. On average today, we process about a couple of million conversations per month with residents over text across the US and Canada. And
Wow.
so each of those is being processed by our systems, LLMs that are looking at everything we know about the property to create the appropriate responses, and then helping our human team in the loop to have better conversations with residents. If you've ever rented before, you know it kind of sucks because your landlord doesn't care about you. That's what we're trying to change.
That is so wild. So when I think of other businesses doing a couple million conversations per month, I'm thinking of the huge people that literally do chatbots as a service, things like the intercoms. What's your model strategy? Like, who are you paying a ton of money to, or are you running your own open source, or how do you think about that?
We're not paying a ton of money to anybody, but our model strategy is sort of just best of breed. So we use a mix of models across all of the closed source providers. We have some stuff that we're testing with Llama on the side, but broadly it's a mix of OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google are the big ones. And the what we have learned right now, I would say we favor Gemini 1.5 Flash over everything else, which is
Hmm.
how we also manage our costs and latency by a pretty good margin.
Uh,
But like what we found is that we don't think of it as like one model for everything. We think about it as there's a ton of different workflows. We'll get into some of those as we talk through, but like we found that the OpenAI models tend to be the best analysts.
hmm.
The Anthropic models tend to be the best writers, and the Gemini models broadly tend to be the best detectives, if you want to think about it that way, right? Like they're great at finding needles in haystacks when looking at large contexts. And so that's our general framework. But
Hmm.
then from a tactical standpoint, if you ask me how I did this, it is literally I had Claude spit out a bunch of code that lets me switch models on the fly. Um, by just tweaking settings in my database. And
Uh,
so we're always testing new models on some subset of our conversations
hmm.
and then trying to figure out what's best for what, without trying to dive too much into the rabbit hole of constantly tweaking and testing what is ultimately a non-deterministic thing.
Sure. Well, okay. So that makes sense on the model side. The other part that's going to get complicated very quickly is the prompt strategy. So, yes, there's the actual prompts that you do, but how do you do prompt versioning or like prompt testing or orchestration of your prompts? What do you all do there?
The simple answer is that we trust the Anthropic prompt generator by a lot,
Hmm.
right? So we basically have our prompt strategy is dictated by whatever Claude thinks is a good prompt.
Sure.
We have tons of structure in our prompt too, and there's a couple of maybe deeper learnings that are fairly hard earned. I think what we found is that. Um, if you can manage your token budget decently well, the Anthropic strategy of everything is XML works quite well across any model.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's gotten much easier now because everybody offers some form of prompt caching as well. But even
Sure.
before that, we were all in on XML and structured inputs and outputs. And then more broadly, I think we think about we stuff a lot of context into the prompts is I
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
easiest way to think about it.
Uh-huh.
And we're making the bet that it's going to get easier and easier with prompt caching, batching, etc to manage stuffing the prompt on the input side than to try and break things into multiple workflows, right?
Sure.
I always like the Sam Altman thing of just try and just keep betting that the models and the interfaces are going to get better.
Sure, sure. That makes sense. Out of curiosity, have you all done the math on
Yeah.
how much you're actually saving on prompt caching? I'm always curious to hear, like, because Anthropic, they market it's up to 90%, but then in actuality, it's not actually 90%. It's more like in the 30 or 40 range I've heard from other folks. What are y'all at?
About half.
I mean, still, 50% is like pretty insane.
Yeah, I would say we see more savings, funny enough, on GPT than we do on Claude.
Mm,
I think whatever OpenAI launched in the last few weeks, um, whatever they're doing out of the box on their backend, is working much better.
yeah.
Claude is we find a little bit finicky with the prompt caching, and we've
Mhm.
we've actually um, seen sort of mixed results. So it's 50 on a good day, but it can be 30 on a bad day.
Yeah. Oh, 15. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it's because OpenAI, you don't have to do any extra work. You just literally send them the same prompt and they take care of it for you. But on Claude, you have to do the
That's
breakpoint,
right.
which is kind of not annoying per se. Well, it's extra overhead, so it's annoying, but it's just more management you have to think
Mhm.
about. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's like it is variable, but it's certainly not 90%, not
Sure.
by a
Sure.
long shot.
Sure. 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 Yeah. Totally.
At
Okay.
least not yet.
Yeah, for sure. And so I was going to say, one of the other things from our previous conversations that attracted me to your background a ton was that you have a unique mindset as a business owner to kind of go Sherlock Holmes AI style into your business, find different workflows that need automating and being like actually executing against them. So before we dive into specifics,
Mhm.
because I know we'll get into that in a second, but like, what's the mindset that you have as you're looking at your team and you're looking at AI? And they're like, okay, I know that there's something here. How do you go find out what they need?
Maybe one thing that I've noticed about me and my co-founders, and just broadly at Residesk, that I think is slightly different from other founders working with AI I've seen is we don't care about AI doing the whole thing, right? Like our business is built with the model of a human in the loop.
Hmm.
And so we think of AI almost as shortening the commute between starting a task and finishing a task,
Mm,
not so much as automating something. So
mm,
I am okay with, if I have a five step workflow, I'm okay with AI doing 80%, going from 10% to 90% on each of the five steps,
sure.
as opposed to trying to figure out how can I automate the whole thing. And I think that frees you up. It makes you look at AI in a whole different way. It's just about saving me time, and not so much about automating the task. And I think that's maybe a little bit different than people looking to just automate things with AI.
Totally. And to take the self-driving car metaphor, it's like you're cool if the FSD wants to drive on the freeways, but
Mhm.
you'll still drive it on the cities in the
Yeah,
tricky parts.
that's exactly right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, I love that. So let's get a little tactical here. So let's before we dive into some demos, because I know you have some really cool demos to show us. Um, I would love to hear about what do your customers not see that's AI enabled?
So everything from when we sell into a property, right? Like how they set us up, sending us their lease documents and turning that into a questionnaire. What somebody else would do as a big like training step on the AI, they just email us and then we take care of the rest in terms of turning it into structured data.
Hmm.
When they pay us we live in an industry that still pays with paper checks,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
I have AI I scan the receipts in the power scanner and then I have AI that reconciles those payments.
Wow.
Because if I sign a contract with Greg's property management company, I'm actually getting paid by all 40 of Greg's properties. And so I
Oh,
have a
yeah.
diffusion problem that I'm then solving on the other end. When we have conversations that we are escalating back to our customers about something that needs to get fixed in somebody's apartment or a ticket that we create in their system, right? They get a diagnosis, but all of that stuff is happening through AI powered workflows in the background. There's
Mhm.
always a human component to it, which is why we have so much margin for error. That's the other thing that I think is unique about us is I can kind of go ham with AI stuff because I know there is always a human in the loop to
Mm.
backstop anything I'm not doing well. And because of that, I can cycle through a bunch of iterations much faster than anybody else can.
Sure, sure. And what sort of tool stack do you have that makes it so easy to do human in the loop stuff? Because that's not easy to like orchestrate and integrate into existing tools. And so what do y'all do?
We make heavy use of drop-in workflows from tools like Command Bar, now Command AI, that was recently bought by Amplitude,
Hmm.
and a bunch of retool embeddings. And then
Mm.
we have a lot of back-end workflows that are specifically enabled by Front, which is our email client, which is
Nice.
then super pluggable into Make, which then plugs into all of the AI systems.
That's wild.
So again, for our internal teams, they're never really flipping back and forth and going to ChatGPT to use something. I mean, they have the tools; they're encouraged to if they need it. But
Sure.
broadly speaking, we're baking AI into those workflows as a kind of automatic thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So of those tools that you did mention between Front, Make, and the other two, I'm forgetting what they were, but which one impresses you?
Retool and Command Bar.
That's right, Retool and Command Bar. Which ones do you look at and are just like,
Yeah.
holy cow, I'm pretty impressed with the product that they're doing, and I think that it's underrated. More people should be looking at them.
Um, so it's very hard to say that Retool is underrated, even though that would be my natural answer. Like Retool is the one that I think I just wouldn't be able to ship code without.
Mhm.
And Command Bar is not underrated. Front is not underrated. So I'm going to go with Make,
Okay.
right? Like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think Make lives way too far in Zapier's shadow.
Uh-huh.
I think they're actually a far better product.
Mm,
It's insanely good in the ways that it plugs into things, and you can actually debug workflows that would otherwise be a nightmare to build with
mm,
any other tool.
That's interesting. Cool.
And it's like it breaches the low code, no code barrier enough that I think a person with skills on the engineering side can use it phenomenally well, as can people who are maybe systems minded but don't have the engineering skills.
Sure.
And I think that's kind of a special thing for a tool to achieve.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Well, I tell you what, you mentioned some of those tools. I would love to dive into some of those tools. And so prior to
Mhm.
the interview here, you shared a couple of really cool examples. What do you think about starting with the command bar retool create summary emails one? I'd love to see how you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Beautiful.
In a prior world, before we had these integrations, what would happen is we would basically copy this conversation, put it in a transcript,
Hmm.
write a summary email, open our email client, and then send it to the team that actually works on site, right? And the idea is that, as I said before, the site team interacts with us as if we were a virtual extension of their team. That means we don't give them new tools. They just live in their inbox, and we send things to their inbox when they need to look at it,
Mm,
right? So you can probably imagine bunch of context switching, bunch of lookups, lots of room for manual error.
sure.
And so that's we wanted to bring all of that into the context of Resida. So the first investment that I'm going to talk about here is Command Bar. So Command Bar is, for anybody who's unfamiliar, effectively a way to replicate the power user Command K functionality inside your app. So think of it as opening up a menu of functions that you can actually trigger,
Mm,
right? And so I press Command K here. It shows me all of the different shortcuts in my application. It can even be context dependent. And the cool thing about it is that you can create these commands both via a JavaScript API as well as a GUI. So I basically just
mm,
dropped. You can see all of my actions here because I'm in the admin view. But I just dropped a couple lines of code into my application, and I was already able to set up command bar. You can do a lot of cool things with it that we're not going to get into right now, but you
sure.
can even create, automations based on, hey, if I hit the shortcut, click this button, then this button, then this button. Super powerful, right?
Cool.
And so we have a workflow here that just tells me here's how I escalate a conversation. Again, our team would actually use the shortcut. I use it much less. And one of the cool things that it does is we can then have our team make judgment calls on a couple of steps that they need to fill in before we can generate the summary, right? So I now see this is actually a pretty high risk conversation because the resident is really upset. And if we don't fix this, they're not going to pay their rent on time, which is then a big issue, right?
Mhm.
So I'm going to say charges on rent. And I'm going to highlight a couple messages that they talked about. And
Oh, cool. So it's actually going to the chat and it's actually grabbing all that
yeah,
information so you can pick what's relevant and what's not.
correct. Correct. So because command bar is super flexible, right? I had a multi-step workflow. My team is picking sort of what they want to talk about. And then again, because I can embed retool apps into anywhere in my code, command bar ran a bunch of steps, hit an API on my backend that goes through, read through all of this, read the things that I wanted to highlight, and then give me a summary of the conversation. This opens a modal, and now what you're looking at inside all of this, so everything below escalate, is actually a retool app that is embedded within my actual code,
Hmm.
right? And the cool thing about this is retool embed. I have now passed in through React a couple of parameters that give it context about what account this is, what customer this is, and what property this belongs to. Retool is then interfacing directly with Front, which has our contact lists and our user lists, which
Wow.
is how we sort of keep them in sync. Picking out the right people that they should go to. In fact, for some of our customers, we even customize this based on what the topic of the message is. So, payment conversations go to payment teams, electricity conversations go to the utility teams,
Mm.
whatever that might be.
Hmm.
It is auto generating a subject line. It's auto generating a conversation summary. And then all my team needs to do, there's a picture of a cat because we're including the entire thing.
Nice.
But it's looking at the images. It's going to figure out what I am trying to say and tell us, okay, incorrect charges on the resident account, blah, 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 blah. All of this is being generated automatically with AI. And then if I hit escalate, which I'm not going to do now,
Uh-huh.
this message goes straight to the site team. Again, this is a workflow that before sort of shipping all of this stuff would be copy the conversation, summarize it, put it into a new email,
Hmm.
look up who it should go to,
Hmm.
put that in, fill out the subject line, send it, and then log in the conversation itself that this happened. So this is happening hundreds and hundreds of times a day for every one of the customers that we support, right?
Uh-huh.
And by keeping our team in the context of the conversation at all times, I am saving, I think we estimated it on average something like 20 to 30 man hours a week.
Wow. Yeah, that's wild. That's absolutely that's
Yeah.
wonderful. What are the other top
Yeah.
used command bar shortcuts on there?
So we have a bunch of things. I would say the most important thing is just translating messages. We use that quite a bit, as you can probably imagine. Um, there's also quite a few other things as well.
Uh,
So we can do things like I'd say escalating conversations and looking at common themes is a big one.
hmm.
And so you can sort of navigate through the inbox. We've basically built this to be a power user app.
Okay.
But again, because we have command bar and retool, you can use this with just your mouse and be okay. But if you're a power user, you can use it well beyond that. The other thing that we have, just like any other prompt engine, would be we have a bunch of AI use cases. Again, this is all just set up with command bar. I've set up a bunch of different templates, but
Sure.
you can see it can do all the things that Grammarly can do for you. So again, I have Grammarly on my machine, but our team can use it without needing to again set up a new tool on their machines.
Yeah, that's very cool. Do you have stats on what percentage of your company is using like AI features within command bar?
Yeah, I mean it's about well, everybody who use actually it's 100%.
Uh-huh.
And
That's wild.
I'll explain why is all of our team has to use the Residesk app
Uh-huh.
to actually talk to residents. And so we don't think about it so much as AI features, more just that it's baked into it. And
Sure.
I'll explain a couple more things in a second, but
Cool.
like actually no, I'll do that right now because this is also a fun thing, right? Is if you go back, and we'll get into this, I think, as we talk about like thinking about unstructured data and turning it into structured.
Sure.
I would say our team doesn't need to think too much about AI because what's happening is, okay, another conversation. Here's somebody who's asking if they can make, partial payments. So they don't want to pay their rent up front. They want to pay it in a couple installments, right? We had at some point a guideline that we scraped from the property or from one of the responses from the site team about how you can pay your rent through alternative methods. That then comes is auto-populated, as I'm sure you can see here,
Hmm.
as a response. So just again, we draft responses to every message as it comes in
Mm.
based on property context and conversation history. And like the way that our customers that our team thinks about it is we don't really even talk about things like saying AI, but it's like, okay, let me think about a couple of different ways to respond to this conversation. I click view all responses. It's like, okay, do you want to be a bit more supportive? Do you want to be a little bit more factful? Different residents require sort of different touches.
Sure.
We try to make it basically a native part of how they think about it, more so than trying to get our team to adopt new actions and responses, if that
Sure.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And what's interesting about this is the theme of
Hmm.
presenting a few options to the user and then having the user pick which one they want keeps on coming up like
Hmm.
just in my around me here. So like instead of making
Yeah.
the AI go and guess what is the exact response that the person wants to do, just let the human take it the last mile and
Yeah.
figure out which one. So like does that make its way into other parts of your flow as well with regards to multiple options presented?
Um, Not quite. I think the you saw the two main ones,
Sure.
which is the like having a conversation with a resident is actually the place where you need the most number of judgment calls by a human.
Mm,
So that's where we let sort of to keep going with your FSD analogy. I think that's where we would let the driver take the wheel,
sure.
just because there's so much nuance to be applied here. And while we trust our trust our models to come up with good answers, they don't always come up with great answers unless you force them to bring in options.
Yeah.
So it makes the system a bit more fault tolerant in both ways. There are other places where this is not quite true. So you can imagine, so you can see here, right? Like there is a you can see that we assign a risk level, for example, to every conversation.
Mhm.
This is fully determined by AI,
Mm,
where it's like, okay, this is a high risk response because it's a rent payment financial concern that requires a timely response. This is all fully generated.
mm.
So I think you picked up on the theme because I'm also showing you the two most external facing workflows that need a human to sign off
Yeah,
before they go out into the world.
totally.
But
And
outside of that, we do have it generate options and reasons.
mhm.
And we find that that actually works quite well.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Well, on that one specifically, using LLM as a judge, more or less, to grade the risk level of these things, sometimes that's not as easy as it looks because you need to like encode different criteria, and if it meets criteria, then give it a certain level. What was that process like to implement that? Was it straightforward, or did it give some hard time?
It took us, I would say, a few months to
Mm,
actually figure it out.
hmm.
I think there are a few things that we were struggling with. I think one, it's funny, right? Like the one universal lesson slash callus is when you want to ask an LLM to do something, you better have a pretty damn good idea what good looks like for yourself.
Uh-huh.
You're all like, or we're like, okay, what is the risk level of the conversation? And you can go really deep down that rabbit hole and realize that there's a different answer for everybody. And so we did a lot of we have a custom GPT called Sparring Partner,
Hmm.
which is basically just built to challenge every idea you throw at it.
Could we take a look at that one?
Yeah,
That'd be fun to see. Like,
actually, I think we have the latest iteration on Claude now. So let's
nice.
just go.
Well, so that's interesting. So why move over to Claude instead of the GPT on ChatGPT?
Right now, it's just because we have chosen Claude as the blessed tool for the team, but we
Sure.
move around quite a bit.
Um, I'm curious, how did you tactically make this sparring partner? If it's a project, is it just like the custom instructions that come on into it?
Yeah, pretty much. So you can see here, I'm trying to make a risk framework for conversations. I want it to be binary. tell me how you think about this. And I'm oversimplifying this,
Sure,
like
sure.
ours were pages and pages. Right. And it's a lot of like, okay, clarifying questions. What do you actually mean when you say binary, blah, blah, blah? And so we went back and forth through this a bunch of times to then come up with, effectively, we came up with a 5 tier framework,
Hmm.
right? Which was, okay, like broadly speaking, and it's funny because you can always intuit your way back into this, but it's like, okay, there is a really urgent fire, flood, blood category, and then there's a really not urgent okay, thank you category.
Hmm.
And so even if you went by its just sort of standard survey design, you would come up with 5 tiers. Then we had effectively went back and forth with the Anthropic prompt generator to say, here's what a tier one, two, three, four, five conversation looks like.
Hmm.
And then it was a bunch of iterations on different models. We looked at a sample of about 1,000 conversations to look at
Oh.
the distribution of scores and
Hmm.
why.
Hmm.
And then this answer I don't think anybody's going to like, but we eyeballed it um, to see if it intuitively made sense to us. And then you just got to pick where you're willing to be wrong, right? Like, so we were okay with overfitting the risk and saying conversations were, we were okay with tons of false positives. We just didn't want any false negatives.
Hmm.
Because again, if you're complaining about a leak in your kitchen sink, I want to know about it. I'd rather be a little bit more alert
Hmm.
to problems that aren't actually problems.
Sure.
So once we had that, that gave us sort of the first iteration of our risk framework.
Cool.
And then after that, the process is pretty straightforward, right? Like, so we look at a sample of maybe a few thousand conversations every week, and have well, previously 4.0, now oh 01, go
Hmm.
through it
Hmm.
and highlight anything that doesn't feel right.
Hmm.
Um, and then we also have a human on the engagement team who's responsible for finding conversations that are an NA on the risk scale and then giving us an opinion on what it should be.
Sure.
And that's how we're going through it. Eventually, we see this as, and we're partly in the process of building this, a much more automated eval framework that will sort of self-correct as
Sure.
it goes,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and look at the last five correctly and badly marked conversations.
Totally. Tell me about the shift to O1 and why you chose it for that one. Because I think a lot of people are still asking, like, I know O1's good. I know that it thinks a lot before it gives me an answer, but like, what types of tasks do you think it's better at versus 4.0 would be good at?
The rule of thumb for me is this worth overthinking?
Mm.
Right? Like it's a lot of like unstructured stuff like, hey, I just had this really rough conversation with a customer today. They went on about a lot of things they don't like about our process. Um, Here's the transcript of the conversation. Here is the PDF of my website, so you have context on what I do. Um, Here's what I'm worried they're actually saying. Talk to me about this.
Mm.
That's the kind of stuff that it's fantastic at, right? Like
Cool.
it's trying to find a little meaning in fuzziness. But we don't use it for anything in production right now.
Mm.
We find it to be a little bit too much of an overthinker for the types of process we have. And the bias here is that we try to build processes, as you've seen even with that little workflow. We try to build processes that are many small steps that you can compose together. And
Hmm.
so we get a lot of bang for the buck out of just breaking down prompts to the simplest possible thing and then giving it to the dumbest possible model.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that.
So it doesn't meander.
Yeah, that's a workflow I think a lot of people could do. Well, I tell you what, I want to jump on to just at least a
Mhm.
few more of these cool suggestions you had. So let's stay on
For
the
sure.
Claude. Let's stay on the Claude projects one. So you're uploading call transcripts and voice notes,
Mhm.
and yeah, tell me more about that.
We have a project that's basically set up to our writing style. It's not that fancy. It's literally just a Harvard Business Review writing style of bottom
Nice.
line up front, and here's what you say.
Uh-huh.
And then we upload our call transcripts and then go back and forth with it. I will say mostly a lot of it is just for me to say candidly what I think after a
Uh-huh.
call, and
Sure.
then have it sort of polish the thing, right? Like everything from, hey, you need to pay for the product or we're going to shut off service, which I promise you I did not word as nicely as that,
Sure.
to, hey, like you might have a bunch of in-house things that you think could replace ResiDesk, but here's why our solution is actually better.
That's interesting. Uh,
Yeah.
do you have that project? Like, could you just show us like going into the project and let's see that like even a preview of the system prompt would be really cool to see.
So this is something that we did as a one-time exercise and then set up as a system prompt.
Awesome.
So it's pretty straightforward, right? So this is a conversation that we had with a tough prospect who was trying to build their own solution in-house, which often happens, right? Like sometimes people are evaluating buy versus build.
Hmm.
And so the prompt is literally like, write me an email, somebody who was skeptical about why our tech would beat something they did in-house. Here's my draft so far. Ask me clarifying questions. I'm aiming to get a short, sweet draft that encapsulates our technical depth and data mode. This is literally the system prompt.
Uh-huh.
And then at the end, I also have this, which is I'm attaching the transcript of our call so you get a deeper handle on the issue. And then the only thing that I add to everything is ask me clarifying questions. By doing this and then throwing what I want in there, it is okay. Can you provide more details on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? And then I'm
Mm.
just going back and forth on it conversationally. Um, and I'm just throwing everything I have at it, which then gives me a rough email that I can use, right? And then I'm going to like, how can I make these ideas hit harder?
Mm.
And then eventually going back and forth, I'm like, I don't have enough data to hit harder. Okay, ask me clarifying questions on each point. I'll provide these insights, go back and forth, go back and forth, go back and forth. And then eventually ended up with a fairly, if I scroll down, a fairly quick email. And then I was like, also use my tone. And then I can be like, I can say something like this, right?
Nice.
Pretty straightforward thing. I wouldn't do this for everything, but like the fact that you can just drop this in there and then think through the LLM interface is insanely good. Because then I can take the same thinking and share it with my team and have them debate it. And so you just get better after every turn.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense. I mean, and even just having like a brainstorming partner and buddy with that to give you like a different perspective is super valuable as well.
Yeah. So here's another fun piece, which is um, I was working on, and I'm just going to show you the output of this. But one of the things that we need to put together for some of our due diligence workflows is trying to help people understand how we integrate and when we interact with residents, right? And so I actually worked with Claude to basically say, here's our like general workflows, and we had that outlined as a piece of text, and then had it turn each of them into a mermaid diagram that I could then and let's find out. So this is like, okay, here's what happens when somebody opens a ticket. We start with, is the issue reported? Get the details. Does it already exist? Create it, update it. Then after that, we start processing it. If it happens, escalate, blah, 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 and then come back. And then when it's closed, we close it, right? These are all fairly straightforward things that
Hmm.
I could describe as code by actually writing the code,
Hmm.
but the ability to have a conversational interface that generates these diagrams for me and I can edit in real time was insanely helpful, right? Like, because we went from having a due diligence request on Monday to having a full presentation on everything on Tuesday, which
Wow.
is not not how things usually go.
No, that's not usually how it goes. So with those flows and diagrams, are you
Yeah,
training your team on how
no.
to do those? And so there's like no ambiguity, or what do you use those for?
We can feed the mermaid diagram back into prompts
Mm.
to check after the fact on a conversation if we actually follow the process, right? And that's actually really fun because I can be like, here's the transcript, and
Uh-huh.
we do this less often than we really should, but it's like, here's the process we should have followed. Here's the process as it played out in the conversation between Greg and us
Mm.
from day 1 to day 30. How close were we? And it's actually something that we're starting to bake into our QA process. So something we've learned, and this comes back to one of those little things that you learn about token efficiency, is if you can describe the process as mermaid code, then you get a lot of bang for the buck inside the prompt. especially when you're building like a QA workflow of how closely did we stick to what we were supposed to do.
Sure. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating because it's traditionally very hard and very fuzzy to like look at a conversation of unstructured text and say, did this agent or did this person or did this employee actually follow the flow they're going to? So to have 4.0 Mini or 4.0 look at it and be like, yes, they did, or yes,
Yeah.
no, they didn't. Like that seems like a really cool tool to make sure your team is staying on track.
Yeah. So something we're still building out, but the fact that it was actually fairly trivial to get a prompt to tell us if we were, 60, 80, 90% on track.
Yeah.
And we're still iterating through, again, much like the risk level calibration, I think we'll end up with a 1 to 5 scale on this too.
Yeah.
But like being able to look at that for a million conversations at scale is
Yeah.
super interesting.
That's absolutely wild. What about in terms of observability tools do you use? And so what are you
Mhm.
using to like track your calls and costs and everything?
So we do a couple of things. So obviously we have everything that we do with AI goes through I just have a light middleware that is logging every request and results back into our database. Um, I think it's kind of absolutely mandatory that the first thing that you build is just observability infrastructure with all of the AI stuff. And so I literally just have a Postgres table that logs every request I've made to every provider through every pipeline. Um, the the other thing that we use that we are just testing out is I don't know if you've heard of Gentrace.
Oh yeah, big time.
So we use Gentrace quite a bit, and that's who we use to monitor costs broadly.
Uh-huh.
So we have all of our calls going through them too. These guys are great. Know the founders, love them.
Nice.
They also offer testing, which we don't quite use. But for costs, we use Gentrace, and then for internal monitoring, just because so much of our workflow is just conversation QA,
Hmm.
we just use our database.
Yeah.
So the idea behind it is that once you have basically an entire history of every AI call that you've ever made,
Uh-huh.
then you can just look at subset of that data to feed your QA workflows or at least test them.
Yeah, that's wild. I love that. That's super cool.
Let's maybe start with thinking about how we turn unstructured data into structured data that we can actually use,
Hmm.
right? So one of the other cool things that we do with Retool is the hard part about understanding and answering resident questions at any property is just knowing what the property is about, right? Do they have a pool? When is it open? What is their pet policy? What is their parking policy, etc. If you've ever lived at any rental property before, you know that these things don't live in like neat structured online documents. They live in random PDFs that
Yeah.
nobody's ever seen before. And so it is really hard, save for um, save for actually like going in and writing things down to get the institutional knowledge that you have on a property. So one of the fun things that we built was a retool tool so that our teams can use internally. So the interface for this is we will typically ask our customers when they set up a property on ResiDesk, hey, like send us any documents that you have our way, right? Like it's a lease document, it's a flyer for an event, whatever it might be. And so by doing that, we take on the sort of work of turning that unstructured data. It could be a PDF, it could be a painting, who the hell knows, and turning it into guidelines that we can actually use. So our team has this retool app that you can browse. I'm just going to here's like a pet policy that I have on hand, and I can take that and say, okay, here's the guideline. And by saving it, what it's doing is taking a document that, let me just quickly show you what it looks like. But um, this is what that document will typically look like, right? Like, and this is actually more structured than a typical document would be. But here's all the responsibilities, here's all the agreements, here's the liability, et cetera, et cetera. We have a tool that is then taking that and actually turning it into an FAQ. So it creates a blurb, it uploads the document, and then it actually uses, this is using Gemini behind the scenes because it's so good at finding needles in haystacks,
Hmm.
the most common questions that you have that a resident could have about these things, right? But then what happens on the back end is even more interesting, which is All of this gets vectorized. The raw text of the document, the blurb, and all of the individual questions that we picked up from it. And so when that happens, what that lets us do is bring up uh, do RAG in a really efficient way where we look at conversations that people are asking about. So like this resident asking about partial payments, and
Hmm.
then bring up the related guideline and tell you what the answer is. This then feeds into the doc into the answers that we suggest, which then makes our RAG workflow a lot easier. By doing this, we were able to sort of see an uptick in the number of questions we answer on day one. So when we started ResiDesk, I think we were answering something like 60 to 65% of resident questions on day one. After we started just taking in any sort of unstructured data, we're now answering closer to like 85% of
Hmm.
resident questions on day one. And it
Wow.
only happens because we are able to abstract away this really dumb workflow of send me whatever the hell you have that looks like a property document, and we will make it useful for ourselves without
Hmm.
having people go through like a big questionnaire that they need to fill out. So
Yeah.
anybody building an AI tool out there that needs to be trained on data, this is an easy hack.
And what's crazy is that this easy hack, you just did it yourself with some retool and some like slight prompts and then turning into structured data.
Yeah. So here's another internal workflow if you're ready for some insanity of just dealing with payments and property management. So again, context is we sell ResiDesk to Greg. Greg has a set of, let's call it 15 properties, right? If I bill Greg for 15 bucks, and I'm making the math so funny here, but
Sure.
basically like it's a dollar per property. Let's just call it that. Uh, the way that real estate has worked for a long time, I said it was first, uh, each of your properties would just pay me a dollar. So I'm left stuck with a $15 invoice that I then have to itemize and then reconcile.
Wow.
Customers pay us in checks. We have a workflow that scans and then reconciles for us in Stripe. But that's not the crazy end of it. In an effort to digitize, what's happened in real estate is now those 15 properties will typically push that check to a third-party clearinghouse that then turns that check into a one-time use credit card that they send us along with the invoice
Interesting.
number. So
Wow.
what I end up with, I'm gonna share my screen because
Yeah.
this is literally the nuttiest thing that we have seen in our time here. What I end up with is something like this. So you can see this email here. It comes from a third-party clearinghouse. It's, you know, a payment for $5 for this and a payment for $208 for this for these invoices, right? Behind the scenes on this is you can see here this little thing called click here to view card information. You open that. Our customers actually send us a one-time use credit card that is only valid for 30 days, and we have to pick up the card number, figure out what invoice this belongs to, and then pay it within those 30 days, or
Wow.
that payment expires, right? And then we have to go through the whole process all over again. Uh, as you can probably imagine, this is a complete pain in the neck for us
Yeah.
to do
Wow.
manually. Because,
Uh-huh.
as I said, if Greg has 15 properties, we get 15 of these every
Hmm.
month, right? And so this is where Make has been our best friend. And Front has been our best friend. So what we've been able to do is say, okay, you can automate things on tags in Front. So when I assign a tag that just says, billing payment reconciliation,
Hmm.
you can create a webhook that goes to Front and or to Make, sorry. And then what happens inside of Make is it then finds the sort of content of the message. It opens the link, takes a screenshot of it after a small delay, and then OCRs it to get the card details, finds the link of the conversation in Stripe, finds the links of the associated invoice in Stripe, and then adds them back as comments into the conversation, which we then, if the payment amounts actually fully line up, we will automatically pay, and then the whole thing is automated. If the
Wow.
payment amounts don't line up, then it alerts our billing team to then manually pay the invoice in Stripe. So again, by doing this, we are processing, as I said, we serve about 1 million residents across the US. So we are now processing something on the order of probably like six to 800 one-time credit card payments a month. And
Oh,
like nobody has the time to do that. The other side of the automation, which I'm incredibly bullish on, will happen with things like Claude computer use, but isn't quite there yet.
mm-hmm.
Is we're interacting with software that was built in the mid to late 90s, right? We live in an industry where nobody actually employs software engineers. They just employ contractors to build a thing, and then that's the thing that stays forever. So we're dealing with a lot of like kind of like the what Plaid used to deal with back in the day. We're dealing with a lot of legacy software that is actually fairly RPA resistant too. So because that's the one thing that people actually will invest time and money into combating.
Mm-hmm.
And so we there are systems that our customers use that have APIs, but by and large they don't have APIs. And so we're slowly starting to automate some of the data intake, but then I'm excited to get to a future where Claude or GPT can just have access to a VM where it logs in and gets the data that we need automatically.
Sure.
So we TLDR is I think we want to automate all of our data intake problems,
Mm-hmm.
but from a conversation output to the residents piece, I think that will always have a human in the loop, and that's mostly driven by the product that we're building. We're in the trust business, and
Uh-huh.
residents trust us because we have a human team.
Sure. Yeah, that makes total sense. All right, last question I want to end up with you. So there's a lot of viewers out
Mhm.
there who may be thinking about, hey, I want to implement AI in my business, but I have no idea what to do. So let's say that you're CEO of a new business. Legacy, the business has already been going for a long time, profitable, it's going well. But you're the new CEO, you drop in on day one and they say, we need you to evaluate our workflows and what we're doing. And we need you to make us AI enabled or get us on AI. What's the playbook that you're going to run to look at the whole business and figure out what to do?
It's a great question. We think about this a lot because, again, our industry is really focused on talking about things like what is AI in real estate, as an example, right? To me, the funny part is, I think talking about AI in real estate or talking about how to put AI in my business is about as broad and silly as talking about how do I use Excel in my business, right? I think what people fail to understand is that this is really about specific use cases, not about, throwing Excel or AI magic into your business. So what I would do on day one would be to look at, much like what we did with ResiDesk, look at the most manual workflows that people have and what you need to do. And so what we do internally is, first of all, give people broad access to LLM tools in-house, whatever, like on-prem, think about data security, all of that stuff is great, but like give everybody broad access. I think the playbook for getting people to use AI to help themselves is not a centralized top-down instruction to do certain workflows the AI way, but instead to give people the tools. And then the second part, which is much more important, although the first part never seems to get past IT teams,
Mhm.
second part that's really important is go find a couple folks whose lives would be a lot better. Ideally, somebody who's doing a really repetitive, tedious task, something super manual, and then work with them to build a workflow tailored to them using AI, right? So, example for us is we actually scan paper checks. Our customers pay us with checks, right? And so reconciling invoices becomes a huge deal. Um, I literally sat down with our billing person and said, okay, how do we make this easier? Build a make workflow that then talks to GPT to look at all the receipts that we get and then reconciles it and pays it on Stripe so they don't have to spend time on it. There's probably 100 examples of this in any company that you go to. Find a couple of people who would be great to sit down with and build a really small, cheap, fast process with them.
Mhm.
Like none of this stuff should take you more than a day to ship.
Mhm.
And then make case studies out of that and then have them spread the word to other people in the company about how this was useful to them and how you can be creatively thinking about AI for your own workflow. Um, I can be told as an employee to use AI as much as the executives want,
Uh-huh.
but ultimately, I'm only going to care when it helps me solve something I don't like to do. And it ends up being a very personal workflow to each person. And so what you really need are just these sort of champions of AI inside your organization. If you can go find two, three, five people across different departments that you can spread the word to, and then put them in charge of sharing with everybody else how they do things better, that's when you really start getting the magic, right? It has to be it's almost like a viral B2C adoption curve. You have to make it useful to a few super users and then have them spread it out.
That's so cool. Uh, I love that playbook, and that makes sense to me. Well, I tell you what, Arjun, this has been absolutely fabulous. Thank you very much for just showing, like, just screen sharing and just showing the workflows that you have going on. It's really cool to see what like you're actually doing. So
Yeah,
like, looking at the prompts, looking at the projects. So I really appreciate that, and thanks for chatting today.
absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.